All right, next up, we've got Shai Sachs, who is with Wayfair. And anyone who does any internet shopping will be very familiar with Wayfair. And it's how you build a governance layer on 1,000-year tech. So I think you're going to talk about trust, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. So my name is Shai Sachs. I'm at Wayfair, and I'm going to talk to you today about how we built our governance layer, and along the way, how we sort of figured out a cheat around Conway's Law, and which I think is hopefully going to be fairly interesting and promising. Um, so we'll talk a little bit about the problem that motivated this work, and how we, what the shape of our governance layer looks like. And then I'll get into the process behind all of this work and where I think it holds some promise for challenging Conway's Law in certain situations. So this is me. I'm a staff engineer on the cloud native team here at Wayfair, something of an API aficionado. I have more Bash and JQ Frankenstein scripts than I probably should have to my name. There it is. Last year, I designed our microservice governance layer that we'll be talking about today. These days, I'm working on standing up an enterprise API gateway at Wayfair. The problem that we discovered, as we sort of proceeded down the road of the microservice resolution is hopefully familiar to many developers. The promise of microservices is deploy autonomy, freedom to experiment, a lot of sort of freedom for teams to move independent of one another. And that's great. However, what you see is a quick proliferation of thousands of microservices, far more than anyone can kind of contain in their head at any one time. And what's particularly interesting about that is that the infra underneath those microservices is not monolithic in the way that you might have seen in the sort of good old days of, 1, 2, 3, big services at any given organization. That's a particular pain point for our infra platform teams. So think in terms of, let's say, a database maintenance team, right? The teams that are developing microservices want autonomy. They want to be able to manage their own infrastructure resources. And so you may have a team or an engineer saying something like, I want to add a service account to this database, or I want to delete a service account from this database. Database team, looks at that request and says, is that safe? Does this person know what they're talking about? Do they know what the impact is going to be on their service? Is this even their database? Et cetera, et cetera. In any given situation, a talented database engineer might be able to go spelunking through code, might be able to look some stuff up and kind of figure things out. Might even have naming conventions that are helpful. But at scale, this quickly becomes very difficult. And that is what led us to create a governance layer. We said, well, we have to get a handle on who owns what. So this is the shape of our microservice governance layer. It has two pieces. One is called ownership service, and this holds policies that tell us which engineer, which team is the owner of a given microservice. So the example I like to use is, let's say that one day Wayfair starts to sell books, and we need a service to tell us, which books we're selling at what price, et cetera, and so forth, right? So we have Alice, the engineer, owns the bookstore service. That's the kind of policy that ownership service contains. On the other hand, you have another service called Mocha, which is named after one of my coworkers' cats. And Mocha keeps track of the consumption activity of microservices. So bookstore service maybe depends on a Cloud SQL database. And So we're going to record that association. Bookstore service consumes Cloud SQL database, BooksDB or something. And together you can see that these two work to answer questions like, does Alice have authority to delete service accounts from BooksDB? In that particular case, Alice owns the books catalog, book service. The book service consumes the BooksDB. That's great. Bob, who doesn't have anything to do with the book service, has no such authority. So that helps solve the pain point. Of course, the governance layer is only as good as the data that we put into it. This is really the key to the whole problem. And you're not going to get good governance decisions out of a layer that has bad data. So what we did to kind of populate the data properly, we started with essentially some good guesses. We have a service creation utility at Wayfair that's based off of the Python cookie cutter templating system. And so we had the benefit of a couple of years of service creation metadata to look at, and we could say, okay, well, Alice is the person who created the bookstore service, 3 years ago or something. Probably she's the owner of it. And we could make similar inferences about teams. And once we had that as a sort of seed, we were able to backfill from like the Kubernetes API, from GitHub repositories, things like that. Of course, that gave us a pretty good coverage of the list of microservices here. What we didn't necessarily have was accuracy. And so what we did to provide accuracy on the data is essentially an incentivization system. So we essentially gave developers carrots to fix their data, and then we also gave them the tools to do it. So the carrot in this particular case was the ability to self-manage Kubernetes namespace. That was the first thing that we started with, and then we added others as time went on. So we said, in the case of Alice, right? Alice is the owner of the bookstore service. Bookstore service uses a Kubernetes namespace called, books-svc, something like that. And it's got some pods. And because Alice is listed as the owner in ownership service, she's allowed to delete some pods in that particular namespace. And the way we did that was essentially some clever syncing to Kubernetes CRDs that manifested as role bindings in Kubernetes. So that was kind of fun. And the self-service mechanism to assert ownership essentially manifested as workflows in Backstage, which is our internal dev portal. So it required quite a lot of collaboration across a lot of teams: Kubernetes team, IAM team, the Mocha team, the ownership service team, et cetera, and so forth. But it was quite powerful. We saw really hundreds of ownership assertions in the months following the release. And that was pretty exciting. We were able to see in real time the improvement in accuracy in our system, as well as the improvement in developers' self-service management capabilities. So they were, all of a sudden able to start deleting pods from Kubernetes that used to be tickets to the Kubernetes infra team. All those tickets started going away. So this was all really exciting. But I think what was really interesting was the process behind the product. And I think it helped us kind of challenge the sort of, you could say, iron law of software development, Conway's law. So if you're not familiar with it, Conway's law is coined by Melvin Conway in 1967. I believe it was popularized in the Mythical Man Month. The Fred Brooks book. It's often simplified as you're doomed to ship your org chart. So if you have a product and you give it to a couple of teams, that product is going to wind up, and you charge a couple of teams with implementing that product is going to wind up with two pieces. And that is exactly what happened to us, right? We had a governance layer. We had two different teams working on it, my team and the Mocha team. Surprise, surprise, we wound up with two services. And that's fine, except that for a problem like this one, where at the outset we really didn't know what the heck we were doing, and we were sort of stumbling our way down the path, we could not have said that we need two services. We could not have said maybe we need one service, maybe we need 10. Like, totally difficult to say, and it's difficult to figure out what the staffing plan needs to look like, what the organization needs to look like to support that work. So that's a little bit confounding, right? You don't know what the shape of the problem, what the shape of the solution should be, but you know that the solution is going to wind up in a certain shape, and that could actually be very problematic down the road. So here's kind of how we muddled our way through. First step, as I like to say, hack your way to Valhalla, get the job done. And so we wound up, having one team kind of build out a series of APIs, another team build out integrations between systems and things like that. And, along the way, we were fortunate to have team interactions that looked a little bit like this. I ask you to do something, you go and do it. And it basically meet the expectations that we set and keep going. Not in every instance, not every commit was perfect, obviously. But, we started out from a place of saying, like, okay, we're all, marching in the same direction, right? Next step is to sort of iron things out and figure out what are the concerns across the different services, start nailing down the APIs. This is actually fairly boring. In most cases, like, it's fairly easy to sort of iron out, like, okay, here's my REST API for policies. It's, get, delete, post. Isn't that exciting? But it's important to write it down. It's important to sort of divvy up the world as makes the most sense, right? From there, once we ship, it's a question of looking at our roadmaps and looking at requirements. So requirements keep coming down the road even after you ship. And you need to kind of keep evaluating those requirements against the concerns that you had written down way back in step one. In our particular case, we came to this kind of interesting tipping point where Mocha was being pulled in two directions. It was being used as a BFF service for our internal dev portal for Backstage. It was also being used as a source of truth for resources in the governance layer, which is the way I've been talking about it. And, we came to see, like, Backstage needs more and more out of Mocha, and, like, that is kind of the direction that service is going in. And we're going to need somebody else to kind of shore up the work on resource consumption. And so we decided to move things around. And this is, I wrote a process down here, but it was something of a messy, like, bunch of Slack messages and meetings and this and that, documents. This was a key paragraph from that time. At a certain point, we realized, my team can do our work and, execute our charter without ownership service, but the Mocha team can't really execute their charter without, my team can execute our charter without Mocha. They can't execute their charter without ownership service. So we need to do a handoff. We need to send ownership service over the wall to the other team. This is a process that we followed. Again, like, not the most exciting thing in the world. Like, okay, add some people to my GitHub repository, show them all my docs, do some walkthroughs, etc., and so forth. But of course, the elephant in the room is, like, it's kind of like handing your baby off to somebody else. Engineers have a tendency to feel strong attachment to their code, and that's very natural, and that's actually a very good thing. But of course, it makes these kinds of handoffs a little bit tricky. The point here is, like, this requires a fair amount of good feeling across teams, right, to do this, one of these kinds of processes, even though the actual steps involved are relatively dry and important to do, but not particularly exciting. The results, I think, are pretty exciting. though, because what we wound up with was a governance layer that is somewhat opaque outside of the confines of the team that manages it, right? You want to ask questions like, oh, is Alice allowed to make changes to a piece of infra? You want to ask questions like, what pieces of infra does a particular service consume? You can send all of those to the governance layer, and the governance layer will answer it. The fact that, at the outset, it's these two services is kind of interesting, but not that important. What is important is that there's one team managing the roadmap for this entire layer, and that there's one team responsible for figuring out how to do that. Whether they merge these services down the road or split them up or do 100 other things is like entirely in their court, and that we don't have a whole lot of crosstalk with two teams coordinating their roadmaps and doing all sorts of gross stuff that way. So this is sort of the meta process. And really the heart of it is redrawing lines, right? You start doing some experimental stuff, you figure out, the best you can, how to clean up or ship that stuff as cleanly as you can. Eventually you're going to figure out you were wrong and that you need to redraw lines and that you need to move things in one direction or another. And that is how we challenge Conway's law is that handoff. But I want to point out that handoff requires trust. And this is the key. And again, we only saw this in the rear view mirror. At the time, we didn't really, a year ago when we started out on this journey, we had no idea that, I'm going to do this handoff in 6 months. I'm going to, need to establish a lot of trust. But it started, sort of ground up. Like, okay, it's one commit, one PR after another. You need me to do this. I'm going to go do it. I'm going to make sure that I did what you wanted me to do. That's great. It proceeded at the layer of systems integrations. You need my system to do CRUD on policies. That's great. Here's my API. I'm going to stand behind it. And it proceeded down to the layer of roadmaps. Like, here's this thing I built. You're the one who needs to manage its roadmap now. Go take it and run with it. And that's really the heart of the equation, is like, even though a lot of these things are very dry and you might say predictable, if I send you a post, I'm going to get a new object back, I'm going to get a new policy back. It's actually quite unpredictable under the surface. It's actually it's really fundamentally a question of establishing trust, person to person, team to team. So I'll leave you with that. I'm happy to answer any questions. My contact information is here, and love to hear any thoughts or questions folks have. Thank you.
Great. Shai, thank you so much for that. I love that you framed the stuff. Sometimes it isn't all that interesting, but it needs to be done. A question came in around what was the timeline in terms of when you realized you needed the governance layer and, kind of where you've ended up, at least at the end of this presentation.
Yeah, so it was, it's very interesting how things have sort of evolved over the year and plus. Let's see, I'm going to say about early 2021. So let's call it 15, 18 months now from like sort of initial concept phase when we were saying like, we need to kind of figure out, who's owning what. And then actual implementation, it took 2-3 months to get the first version out the door. And it was another quarter or so before we realized like, oh, this like redrawing lines thing has to happen actually pretty quickly. So let's see, my personal, ownership of this work was maybe 6 months end to end, let's say March to, I don't know, October or so of last year.
Okay.
And so since then, I mean business, like they really, it's not mine anymore.
Yeah.
And obviously, I still work with that team, and
Yeah.
we have a great relationship, and it's quite nice. But like, it's not, I have slightly less visibility into it than I used to, somewhat by design. I will say though that it's very interesting to see how governance is evolving, because we started out asking questions like, okay, which microservice consumes, which piece of infra. That's very
Yeah.
interesting. It turns out, and I think this is somewhat emerging, I think, but the question of like authorization, it starts to bleed into authorization. So across microservices, right? So microservice A is authorized to use microservice B, turns out to be somewhat related to the question of infra sharing.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that you have, highly related microservices that should have relatively low bars to access sharing infra. And then you have slightly, somewhat less related microservices that should have somewhat higher bars of higher bars of access.
Right.
And so that's like, this is things that we're still noodling on and still figuring out, frankly. But we have, there's an inkling in my head that says, okay, governance layer might play a still more interesting role in like actually off then and off Z decisions, which is definitely not something I would have anticipated a year ago.
Yeah. So 2 questions come from that. One is, you said it was in 2021. So remote, how was that different with managing trust, building trust, fully remote? Did that impact?
It's an interesting question, and I've heard a lot of, I think everyone has like different thoughts and, feelings about that kind of question. I've heard like 2 different schools of thought. One is like, well, you really need in-person communication and face-to-face and all of that. And I agree with that a great deal. I think a lot, is lost when we're looking at each other from the shoulders up. A lot of body language, a lot of just presence that I don't have a really good word for. Flip side of it, and this is the other school of thought I've heard, is like, well, you're kind of being welcomed into one another's like home, which is in a sense a more like intimate view into your coworkers' lives. I literally, Mocha the cat, like literally joined some of our meetings back in those days.
Nice.
And there's a somewhat feeling like, hey, I'm just having a friend over for a chat today.
Yeah.
I think as the general rule though, and I think to close out that thought, like, in a world where we're working with people in different time zones, some degree of remote work is inevitable, even if we're all sitting in conference rooms or what have you. I think that the most important, like, starting with shared understanding of goals and shared understanding of mission is super important, regardless of where you're physically located. And so being able to introspect on like, here's what I'm trying to do, here's what you're trying to do, how can we bring those together, even if there's slightly different goals, is the most important thing. I mean, in software and like just life as well. An understanding of what your counterparty wants out of any given initiative is super important.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The human aspect is the same, whether you're in a relationship at work or, right. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Well, we've got just a second, but I would love to, if you could do real fast, Shai, what would you say are the top lessons learned? Give me 2 things that you're like, if I were to do it differently, it would be this, just real quick.
Top lessons learned, I would have started building this as a single microservice.
Okay. Okay.
And second lesson learned is that I would have been a little bit more concerned with teams as first-class members of our governance layer. We sort of shoehorned that in toward the end.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate the journey. I felt like I was on a very fast ride for a good process. So
thank you.
Shai.
It's been fun.